Think of the center of Europe, and your mind fills in the famous names: Paris, Vienna, Prague, Rome. Between them sits a country most people cannot quite place. They know the name, they could not draw its borders, they have never thought about it for longer than it takes to read the word on a map. Hungary, a landlocked nation in the middle of the continent. 9.5 million people, a capital on a great river, and almost nothing in the mind of the average outsider to hang on to. But this is one of the oldest continuous states in Europe. Its kingdom was founded in the year 1000, before England had a cathedral at Canterbury, before the first stone of Notre Dame was laid. Its people speak a language that matches nothing around them. Not German, not the Slavic tongues of its neighbors, not anything else on the continent. Its history runs 1,000 years deep. Its landscape holds a grassland older than the idea of Europe itself. And in the space of a single afternoon in the 20th century, it lost 2/3 of everything it had. So here is the question. How does a country this old, this beautiful, this consequential, become the one almost no one ever talks about? That is what we came here to understand. Let's begin where the country itself begins, on the water. A river runs through the middle of Hungary and through the middle of its capital, the Danube, Europe's second longest river, born in the Black Forest of Germany, bound for the Black Sea 2,000 miles away. It has passed through Vienna before it reaches here. It will pass through Belgrade after. But in Budapest, it does something it does nowhere else on its journey. It splits a city in two. On the west bank rise the hills of Buda, steep, wooded, crowned with a castle and a royal palace. On the east bank spreads the flat expanse of Pest, a grid of grand boulevards, coffee houses, and apartment blocks. For most of their history, these were two separate towns, facing each other across the water. They were only joined into one city in 1873. The name is simply the two of them, pressed together: Buda, Pest. And along the water sits the parliament. It is one of the largest legislative buildings in the world. Nearly 300 meters long, 691 rooms, 96 meters tall, a number chosen on purpose to mark the year the Magyars first arrived in this basin, 896. Inside, built into its stone, there are said to be 88 pounds of gold. It is a building designed to say something, that this is not a small country, that it was never meant to be a small country. And for one brilliant stretch, around the turn of the 20th century, it was not. In those decades, Budapest was one of the two capitals of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a European power of 50 million people sharing the throne with Vienna. The city grew at a furious pace. It built the first underground railway on the European continent, opened in 1896 and still running today. It raised the grand boulevards, the opera house, the bridges across the Danube. And on nearly every corner, it built coffee houses. They were not simply places to drink coffee, they were the living rooms of the city. Writers, poets, painters, and journalists claimed their regular tables and worked there all day. Some cafes kept pen, ink, and paper on hand for the writers who could not afford their own. The waiters knew which newspaper each customer read. A single grand cafe might seat hundreds beneath chandeliers and gilded mirrors, and out of these rooms poured much of the literature, the journalism, and the argument of an entire golden age. The New York Cafe in Budapest was called, only half in jest, the most beautiful cafe in the world. This was the height. A city that lit its streets before most of Europe, ran trains beneath its pavement, and wrote its books over coffee in mirrored halls. Hold that picture of what Budapest was, because to understand this country, you have to know how high it stood before the fall. But the Danube in Budapest holds more than grandeur. It holds a secret about the ground itself. Hungary sits on a fracture in the earth. The crust beneath it is thin, broken by ancient fault lines, and through those cracks, heated water rises from deep below. Rainwater sinks into the limestone, travels down more than a kilometer, warms against the rock, and pushes back to the surface. Budapest is built on top of this. It has more than 100 thermal springs feeding it, producing tens of millions of liters of hot mineral water every single day. It is the only capital city in the world that is also a certified spa town. The Romans knew it. 2,000 years ago, they built their baths here and called the settlement Aquincum, the place of abundant waters. The Ottomans knew it and built domed bathhouses in the 16th century that still stand and still steam. Beneath the pavement of the modern city runs the largest thermal cave system on Earth, and beneath one of its hills, a lake in the dark that was only recently found. The city floats on warm water. It always has. And the river carries more than the capital. Just north of Budapest, the Danube does something dramatic. Running west across the country, it strikes a range of hills and is forced to turn, bending sharply south in a great sweeping curve toward the city. This is the Danube Bend, and it holds the oldest heart of the kingdom. On a high bluff above the water stands Esztergom, the first royal seat of Hungary, the place where Stephen was crowned around the year 1000, and for centuries the spiritual capital of the whole nation. Its basilica is the largest church in the country, its dome visible for miles up and down the river, standing where Hungarian kings were once anointed. Nearby, the little riverside towns of the Bend, Visegrad with its ruined hilltop fortress, Szentendre with its narrow lanes, mark the stretch of water where the medieval kingdom first took shape. The country did not begin in the modern city on the plain. It began up here, on the bluffs above the Bend, where the river turns. And yet, down by the river's edge in the capital, just south of that enormous parliament, there is a place where the beauty stops. 60 pairs of shoes, cast in iron, bolted to the stone of the embankment. Men's work boots, women's heels, a child's small pair. We will come back to them. When we do, you will understand what happened on this bank in the winter that the beauty could not reach. For now, notice only that they are there, and that the city keeps them at the foot of its grandest building in plain view of the water. Because a place is never only what it shows you first. To understand where the Hungarians came from and why their language belongs to no one around them, we have to leave the river and the city behind. We have to go east, out onto the flat land. Beyond the Danube, the country opens up. The hills fall away, and the land goes level to the horizon in every direction. This is the Great Hungarian Plain, the Alfold, and it covers more than half the country. Flat, open, enormous. In summer, it shimmers with heat. In winter, the wind comes across it without a single obstacle to slow it down. To an eye trained on the neat, fenced fields of Western Europe, it looks like nothing, empty grassland running to nowhere. But this grassland is the key to the entire country, because it is not really a Hungarian landscape at all. It is the westernmost tip of something far larger, the Eurasian steppe, a corridor of grass that runs unbroken from here, across Ukraine, across southern Russia, across Kazakhstan, all the way to the borders of Mongolia and China. 8,000 kilometers of it. And this plain, in the heart of Europe, is where it ends. Which means, for the people who lived on the steppe, this was familiar ground. Around the year 895, 7 tribes came across the Carpathian Mountains from the east. The year is 895. The Magyars are moving. They are horsemen, mounted archers, herders of cattle and horses, a semi-nomadic people who have spent generations crossing the open grasslands of the Pontic-Caspian steppe. They have been pushed westward, harried by other tribes at their backs. Led by a chieftain named Arpad, 7 clans cross the mountain passes, Verica, most likely, and descend into the basin on the far side. And they find the one place in Europe that looks like home. A sea of grass, ringed by mountains, watered by 2 great rivers. They stop. They do not move on. They stay. Everything Hungarian begins in that decision. This is why the language stands alone. Hungarian, Magyar, does not belong to the Indo-European family that produced almost every other tongue in Europe. It belongs to the Uralic family. Its distant relatives are Finnish and Estonian, spoken 1,000 miles to the north. Its deepest roots trace back to the region of the Ural Mountains, on the edge of Siberia, where the ancestors of these people hunted and fished thousands of years ago before beginning their long drift south and west. It is one of Europe's great mysteries, hiding in plain sight. A steppe language, carried by horsemen, planted in the middle of the continent, where it has held on for 1,100 years while everything around it changed. But a people cannot remain nomadic raiders forever in the heart of settled Europe. For the first 100 years, the Magyars did what steppe horsemen had always done. They rode out. Their mounted archers struck deep into Germany, into France, into Italy, fast, mobile, feared across the continent, until, in 955, a German army finally broke them at the Battle of Lechfeld, and the raids stopped. What came next is the true founding of the country. Around the year 1000, a Magyar prince named István, Stephen, was crowned the first king of Hungary, with a crown said to have been sent by the Pope himself. He did something that would decide the fate of his people. He turned them west. He made them Christian, sometimes by persuasion and sometimes by force. And he built a European kingdom on the bones of a steppe confederation, with counties, laws, bishoprics, and stone churches. It was a choice as consequential as the decision to stop on the plain. A steppe people, related to no one around them, chose to become part of Europe rather than remain apart from it. Stephen was later made a saint, and in a basilica in Budapest, in a golden case, the country still keeps its most sacred relic, the mummified right hand of the king who founded it more than 1,000 years ago. Once a year, on the 20th of August, it is carried through the streets of the capital, the holy rite, the literal hand of the man who made Hungary a nation. That is how old this is. The country has a founder, and it still has his hand. And the land itself still remembers what it was. Out here, in a corner of the plain near the city of Debrecen, there is a place where the old steppe survives almost untouched. The Hortobag, Hungary's first national park and one of the last true fragments of the Pannonian grassland left in Europe. There are almost no people living on it, no fences to speak of, just the flat land, the enormous sky, and the animals that have grazed here for 2,000 years. The plain is alive if you know how to look. Above it hunts a small falcon, slate-grey, rust-colored, no larger than a pigeon. The red-footed falcon. It comes here to breed in loose colonies, borrowing the old nests of rooks and crows, and it hunts the insects and voles of the grassland on the wing. The Hortobag is one of its great strongholds. More than 340 species of birds have been recorded across these grasslands and their shallow fish ponds, nearly 3/4 of every bird in Europe. In autumn, tens of thousands of cranes gather here on their migration, filling the evening sky with their calls before they move south. But the bird that belongs to this plain more than any other is one that can barely leave the ground. The great bustard, the heaviest flying bird in the world. A large male can weigh more than 18 kilograms, as much as a well-fed dog, and when it walks the grassland with its head held high, it looks less like a bird than like something left over from an older age of the earth. It needs open ground to run before it can lift into the air. It needs wide, undisturbed grassland to survive. And there is almost none of that left anywhere in Europe. Across most of the continent, the great bustard is gone. Ploughed out, fenced in, shot, forgotten. The open plains it needed became farmland and roads. But here, on the Hortobag, a population holds on. Because here, alone, the steppe was left as it was. The bird survives in Hungary for the same reason the Hungarians are Hungarian, because this one patch of grass in the middle of Europe stayed what it had always been. And the people of the plain kept the old ways too. The grass here cannot be left to itself. Without grazing, it would thicken, scrub would move in, and the open steppe would close over within a generation. So for 2,000 years, it has been kept open the only way it can be, by animals and by the men who move them. They are called the Chicos, the mounted herdsmen of the puszta. They ride in dark blue, wide-sleeved shirts, and they handle horses with a skill that has passed down through centuries. They still work the herds across the Hortobag in the grazing season from spring to autumn, following the same drove roads their ancestors used. And the animals they keep are breeds you will find almost nowhere else. The Hungarian grey cattle, tall, pale, silver-hided, with enormous sweeping horns that can span more than a meter across. A breed shaped by the steppe, hardy enough to live outdoors on the open plain through the bitter continental winter. For centuries, herds of them were driven west on foot, hundreds of kilometers to the markets of Vienna, Nuremberg, Venice. And the cattle trade was one of the medieval kingdom's greatest sources of wealth. And then there is the racka, a sheep unlike any other in the world. Both the rams and the ewes grow long, straight, spiraling horns, twisting up and outward like corkscrews, sometimes half a meter long, so that a flock of them on the grassland looks like nothing else on earth. It is a breed found only here, bred by these people on this plain for 1,000 years. An animal that exists because the Magyars brought their herds across the mountains and never left. The grey cattle, the racka, the great bustard, the grassland that made all three. None of it should still be here, and all of it is. But the plain is only one Hungary. There are others. To find them, we follow the water again, not the great Danube this time, but its quieter sister, the Tisza, Hungary's second river, and in many ways, its more intimate one. Where the Danube is broad, busy, and international, carrying barges between capitals, the Tisza is slower, browner, more inward. It winds down out of the Carpathians and meanders across the eastern plain in great, lazy loops, in no hurry to get anywhere. For the people of the Alfold, it is not a highway to other countries, it is simply theirs. And once a year, for a few days in early summer, something happens on its surface that happens almost nowhere else in the world. The water begins to bloom. It is not a plant, it is an animal, millions of them rising from the riverbed at once. The long-tailed mayfly, Palingenia longicorda, the largest mayfly in Europe, and now found in numbers like this only here, in the Tisza and its tributaries. For 3 years, the larvae live buried in the clay of the riverbank, underwater, in the dark. Then, on a warm evening in June, triggered by the light and the temperature, they all rise together. In a single, synchronized emergence, the surface of the river fills with them, clouds of pale, winged insects lifting into the golden evening air. The Hungarians call it the Tisza River, the flowering of the Tisza.
And here is what makes it almost unbearable to watch.
They have no time. The adult mayfly cannot even eat. It has no working mouth. It has only hours. It rises, it flies. It finds a mate above the water in a brief, frantic dance. It lays its eggs onto the surface of the river, and then it dies. By the time the sun is fully down, the water is covered with them. A whole generation, born and spent between one evening and the next. 3 years in the dark for a single sunset in the light. And they rise all at once, together, because there is safety in the sheer, overwhelming number of them, too many for the birds and the bats to eat, so that enough survive their few hours to begin the cycle again. The people gather on the banks to watch it in near silence, because it is beautiful, and because it is impossible to see it and not think about how short a thing can be, and how much can still happen inside it. The mayfly nearly vanished too. A century ago, these insects filled lowland rivers across Europe. Pollution and the reshaping of the riverbanks wiped them out almost everywhere. When the old communist-era factories closed in the 1990s and the water began to clear, the Tisza River held on here, in this one river system, and even, slowly, began to return to a few others. Today, it is protected by law. To harm the bloom of the Tisza is a punishable offense in Hungary. They keep it, the way they keep the shoes and the grassland and the language. This country holds on to its rare things. Further west, the water gathers into something larger. Lake Balaton, the largest lake in Central Europe, 77 kilometers long, running southwest to northeast across the middle of the country. And for a landlocked people, a nation with no coastline, no sea of its own, it is everything a sea would be. Hungarians call it simply the Hungarian Sea. It sits in a fault, like so much of this country, a long trough in the Earth's crust, filled with shallow, warm, gently green water. In most places, it is only a few meters deep. It warms quickly in summer, so that by July, the whole lake is the temperature of a bath. On its northern shore rise old volcanic hills, their slopes terraced with vineyards. On its southern shore, the water is so shallow you can wade out for what feels like forever. For generations, this is where the country came to breathe. Not to another nation's coast, they had no easy access to one, but here to their own inland water. Families returned to the same lakeside towns summer after summer. It became a place woven into the private memory of nearly everyone in the country. And it tells you something about how Hungary learned to live. Cut off from the sea, it made a sea of its own, turned inward, found what it needed inside its own borders, because for long stretches of its history, the world beyond those borders was not a place it could safely go. That inward turn runs through everything here, even the towns. Take Eger, a small city in the north, tucked against wooded hills, known now for its wine, the deep red they call Egri Bikaver, bull's blood of Eger, and for a castle on a rise above the rooftops. It is a gentle place, a place people visit for a quiet weekend. But in 1552, it was the edge of the world. The Ottoman Empire was at the height of its power, sweeping up through the Balkans and into Hungary, and it had already taken the center of the country. A vast Ottoman army marched on Eger's castle, by most accounts 40,000 men, perhaps more. Inside the walls stood a garrison of around 2,000, soldiers, townspeople, and famously the women of Eger, who fought on the walls alongside the men, pouring boiling pitch and hot soup down onto the attackers, carrying stones, taking the places of the fallen. The siege lasted 5 weeks, and the walls held. The Ottoman army, one of the most powerful military forces on the planet, could not take the little castle at Eger and withdrew. It did not change the war. The Ottomans would return, and 40 years later, they would finally take Eger anyway and hold it for nearly a century. But the stand of 1552 became something larger than its outcome. It became a story the country told itself about who it was. A small people, badly outnumbered, holding a wall against an empire.
Remember that image.
A handful of Hungarians on a wall, refusing to give it up. It will come back, in a different century, on a different kind of barricade. And the Ottoman century left more than sieges behind. In the south of the country sits Pécs, an old city, warm and Mediterranean in feel, with a history that runs back to Roman times. At the center of its main square stands a large domed building. From a distance, it reads as a church. There is a cross on top of it. But look at the shape of it, the wide dome, the proportions. This was not built as a church. It is the largest surviving Ottoman mosque in Hungary, raised in the 16th century by a Turkish pasha on the foundations of a medieval church the Ottomans had torn down. When the Habsburg armies drove the Ottomans out at the end of the 17th century, they did not demolish it. They reconsecrated it. They turned the mosque back into a Christian church, and it has been one ever since. So it stands there now, a Christian church in the shape of a mosque on the site of an older church in a Roman city. 4 civilizations stacked one on top of another in a single building on a single square in a country most outsiders think has no story at all. That is the thing they miss. Hungary is not empty of history. It is layered so deeply in it that the layers grow right through one another. Back out on the plain, that layering has a spiritual capital of its own. Debrecen. Hungary's second largest city, out in the east, the great market town of the Alfold. For centuries, It was the stronghold of Hungarian Protestantism, so firmly reformed in its faith that it earned the name the Calvinist Rome. Its great yellow church has twice served as the meeting place where the nation declared its independence, once in the 19th century and once in the 20th. It is a city with its feet in the grassland and its history in the church, a place where the herding culture of the plain and the stubborn independence of a small people come together. Practical, unshowy, deeply itself. And in the hills north of it, the country makes something the courts of Europe once fought to get. In the far northeast, on the volcanic foothills where the plain meets the mountains, lies the wine region of Tokai. The soil here is old volcanic rock, and the autumn mists that roll off the rivers do something particular to the grapes. They let a fungus take hold, one that shrivels the fruit on the vine and concentrates its sugar into something extraordinary. The result is a golden dessert wine, sweet and long-lived, that was prized across the continent for centuries. It was poured at the court of Versailles. It was sent to the Russian Tsars, who kept a garrison of Cossacks stationed in the region simply to guard the shipments home. Louis XIV of France is said to have called it the wine of kings and the king of wines. This small country, tucked away in the middle of Europe, was making one of the most sought-after wines in the world, and, as with so much else, almost no one outside remembers that it was Hungarian. And on the surface, in a fold of the northern hills, one small village has refused to change at all. Holoko, a cluster of whitewashed houses with wooden balconies and steep shingled roofs, gathered beneath a ruined medieval castle, where the Palok people have kept their traditional way of life. The old village has barely changed in appearance in centuries. The same houses, the same church, the same folk dress worn on feast days. It is protected now as a piece of living heritage, a preserved fragment of the rural Hungary that once covered the whole country, kept intact while the modern world grew up around it. Once more, the same instinct. Hold on to the thing that is yours. Do not let it go. And that instinct, turned in a different direction, helps explain something surprising about this quiet country. For a nation of only around 10 million people, Hungary has produced an astonishing number of the minds that shaped the modern world. Laszlo Biro, who invented the ballpoint pen, the most common writing tool on Earth, still called a biro across much of the world. Erno Rubik, an architect in Budapest, who built a small wooden puzzle to teach his students about three-dimensional shapes, and accidentally created the best-selling toy in human history, the Rubik's Cube. And in physics, a whole generation of Hungarian-born scientists, among them Leo Szilard, who first conceived of the nuclear chain reaction, and Edward Teller, men so brilliant and so concentrated from one small country that their American colleagues, only half joking, called them the Martians. A small nation turned inward, pouring its intensity into the life of the mind. It is the same energy that held the wall at Eger and kept the language alive across the mountains, pointed this time at the century's greatest problems. And that stubbornness, that refusal to be told what to be, is not only in the old stories. It reached its sharpest point in living memory, in the streets of the capital, against an enemy far larger than any Ottoman army. To reach it, we go back to Budapest, and forward to the middle of the 20th century. By the 1950s, Hungary was no longer its own. It had come out of the Second World War on the losing side, been occupied by the Soviet Red Army, and been absorbed into the Eastern Bloc. A Stalinist government ran the country from Budapest, with a secret police, the AVH, that arrested, tortured, and disappeared people at will. In the city park, a bronze statue of Stalin stood 8 meters tall, raised on a plot cleared by demolishing a church. It was a country held down, watched, afraid. And then, in the autumn of 1956, it stopped being afraid. It is the 23rd of October, 1956. University students are marching through Budapest. They have written a list of demands: free elections, the withdrawal of Soviet troops, the return of a reform-minded leader named Imre Nagy. By the thousands, ordinary people pour out of the buildings to join them. The crowd swells to 200,000. They march to the radio building to broadcast their demands. When a student delegation goes inside, the secret police detain them. And then, the AVH opens fire on the crowd outside, and the city rises. It happens with astonishing speed. Workers break into arsenals and factories and hand out rifles. Soldiers of the Hungarian army, ordered to disperse the crowds, climb down from their trucks and join them instead. That 8-meter statue of Stalin is pulled down in the night and dragged through the streets until only the boots are left standing on the empty plinth. Within days, the revolution has effectively won. The Soviet forces pull back from the capital. Imre Nagy forms a new government. He announces that Hungary will hold free elections, that it will leave the Warsaw Pact, that it will be neutral. For a few days at the start of November, Hungary is free. The first country in the Soviet Empire to break its chains and stand on its own. It lasts less than 2 weeks. Before dawn on the 4th of November 1956, the Soviet army returns, and this time it comes to end it. Thousands of tanks roll into Budapest. Whole columns of armor grind through the boulevards. At 5:20 in the morning, Imre Nagy makes a final broadcast to the nation and to the world. A grim message, barely half a minute long, telling them that Soviet troops are attacking the capital and that his government is at its post. Then, the fighting begins in earnest. In the narrow streets and the passages of the city, lightly armed Hungarians, many of them teenagers, boys and girls with rifles and homemade firebombs, try to hold their ground against one of the largest armies on Earth. At a place called the Corvin Passage, a cluster of them fight from doorways and cellars against the tanks. There it is again. A handful of Hungarians, badly outnumbered, on a barricade, refusing to give up the wall. 400 years after Eger, in the same country, the same stand. Only this time, there was no withdrawing army on the other side. By the time it was over, around 2,500 Hungarians were dead. 200,000 fled the country as refugees, across the border into Austria, abandoning everything they owned. Imre Nagy was arrested after being promised safe passage. He was held in secret, tried in secret, and in June of 1958, he was executed and buried face down in an unmarked grave. And the world, which had cheered the revolution on the radio, did not come. No Western army crossed the border. The Hungarians who had risen believing help would arrive learned that it would not. They were on their own. As, in the hardest moments of their history, they had almost always been. Let that sit for a moment, because to understand why it happened this way, why this country rose against an empire with such desperate courage, and why no one talks about the country that did it, we have to go back one more time, 36 years earlier, to the wound underneath all of it. For 1,000 years, the Kingdom of Hungary was one of the great powers of Central Europe. At its height, it was enormous. It stretched across the whole Carpathian Basin, taking in what is now Slovakia to the north, Transylvania to the east in modern Romania, Croatia to the south, and lands that today lie in Serbia, Ukraine, and Austria. Its territory ran to nearly 300,000 square kilometers. Its population was a patchwork of peoples: Hungarians, Slovaks, Romanians, Serbs, Croats, Germans, bound together under the crown of Saint Stephen. For a millennium, its borders had barely changed. It was old, and it was large, and it had endured. It had survived the Mongols. It had survived a century and a half of Ottoman occupation. It had risen again each time. By the early 20th century, it was one half of the Great Austro-Hungarian Empire, a European power of the first rank, with Budapest as one of the twin capitals of an empire of 50 million people. And then, it chose the wrong side of a war. Austria-Hungary entered the First World War in 1914, alongside Germany. Four years later, it had lost, and in losing, the empire simply dissolved. Austria and Hungary split apart, and the victorious Allied powers, meeting outside Paris, sat down to redraw the map of Central Europe, to decide what Hungary would now be allowed to keep. The decision was made in a palace at Versailles. It is the 4th of June, 1920. In the Grand Trianon Palace, a Hungarian delegation is handed the treaty. They are not there to negotiate. The terms have already been set. They are there to sign. And the terms are these. Hungary is to lose 2/3 of its territory. 2/3. In a single afternoon, with a single signature, the 1,000-year kingdom is cut down to 1/3 of its former size. Transylvania, larger than what remained of Hungary itself, is given to Romania. The north goes to the new state of Czechoslovakia. The south goes to the new kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, the state that would become Yugoslavia. Land the kingdom had held for 1,000 years is signed away between one morning and the next. But the deepest wound was not the land, it was the people, because the borders were not drawn cleanly. When the map was finished, more than 3 million ethnic Hungarians, Magyars, people who spoke the language, whose families had lived on that ground for centuries, found themselves on the wrong side of the new lines. Overnight, without moving from their homes, they became foreigners in other countries. 1/3 of the entire Hungarian nation was left outside the borders of Hungary. Families were split by frontiers that had not existed the day before. To this day, there are large Hungarian communities in Romania, in Slovakia, in Serbia, in Ukraine, the descendants of the people the treaty stranded.
The Hungarians have a word for it.
Trianon. And a century later, it is still spoken as the single greatest catastrophe in the nation's history. The Trianon trauma. On its 100th anniversary, in 2020, church bells rang across the whole country for 100 seconds, one for each year, and the whole of Budapest fell silent. And now, finally, The question we started with begins to answer itself. We asked how a country this old, this consequential, this beautiful, became the one the world never talks about. Here is the answer. Because in 1920, the world decided the conversation was over. It took a first-rank European power, a 1,000-year kingdom, one half of an empire, and in an afternoon, it reduced it to a small, landlocked, wounded state, and moved on to the next item on the agenda. The great capitals stopped paying attention. Hungary was diminished on paper, and then, in the mind of the outside world, it was diminished for good. It became small, and being small, it became easy to overlook. But the Hungarians never overlooked themselves. That is the thing the outside world missed. A nation does not forget that it was once large. The memory of the whole kingdom, the language spoken across the mountains, the borders that ran for 1,000 years, did not disappear because a treaty erased it. It went inward. It survived in the culture, in the family memory, in the fierce, stubborn insistence that this small country was the remnant of something far greater. It is why they held Lake Balaton so close, a sea for a people cut off from the world. It is why they kept the grassland and the grey cattle and the racka sheep and the great bustard and the language that matches no other. Because when so much has been taken, you hold with everything you have onto the things that are still yours. And it is why, in 1956, they rose against the Soviet army with such impossible courage. A people who have already lost 2/3 of everything and been abandoned once by the world, fight differently. They fight like people who know that no one is coming and that the only thing they have left to defend is themselves. And it is why, in the winter of 1944, this same city saw its darkest hour. We left 60 pairs of iron shoes on the bank of the Danube. It is time to say what they are. In the last winter of the Second World War, with the Soviet army closing in, a Hungarian fascist militia called the Arrow Cross seized control of Budapest. In the freezing months that followed, they took Jewish men, women, and children out of the city's ghetto, marched them down to the edge of the Danube, and ordered them to take off their shoes at the water's edge. Shoes were valuable, they could be resold. Then they shot them at the lip of the river so that the current would carry the bodies away. An estimated 20,000 people died on these banks. It was one part of a larger horror, the murder of more than half of all the Jews of Hungary, most of them killed in the space of a few months in 1944, in what remains one of the swiftest mass murders of the entire war. The shoes on the embankment mark the exact place where it happened. 60 pairs in iron at the water's edge below the Parliament. They are left empty on purpose. There is no lesson to draw from this, no redemption to reach for. The city keeps the shoes because some things must simply be remembered and stood in front of in silence. Not everyone looked away. A Swedish diplomat named Raoul Wallenberg arrived in Budapest in the summer of 1944 and spent the following months issuing protective passes, renting buildings, declaring them Swedish territory, and filling them with people the Arrow Cross wanted dead. He confronted militiamen directly. He is credited with saving tens of thousands of lives. When the Soviets took the city, they arrested him. He disappeared into their prison system and was never seen again. Even the man who saved them vanished. It is, in the end, a very Hungarian story. Courage in the dark, and then the dark closing over it, and the country left to remember on its own. But that is not where the country is now. The Soviet grip finally broke in 1989. The Iron Curtain, quite literally, was first cut open on the Hungarian border when Hungary opened its frontier with Austria and let thousands of East Germans pass through to the west. It was one of the first tears in the wall that would fall in Berlin that same year. The country that had risen and been crushed in 1956 helped bring the whole Eastern Bloc down 33 years later. Imre Nagy was dug up from his unmarked grave and reburied with honor before a crowd of hundreds of thousands as a hero of the nation. The tanks left, the border opened. Hungary rejoined the Europe it had been cut off from for so long. And the country they had held onto through all of it was still there. The parliament on the river, the warm springs beneath the city, the Great Plain running east to the horizon, the grey cattle and the spiral-horned sheep, the mayflies rising off the Tisza for their single evening, the language that belongs to no one else. None of it had been lost, it had only been waiting. So, why does no one talk about Hungary? Perhaps because we mistake quietness for emptiness. We look at a small country in the middle of Europe, a country that does not push itself forward, and we assume there is nothing there. We do not see that the quiet is the aftermath of something, the inward turn of a nation that was once large and was cut down at the height of a century and chose to survive by holding its identity close rather than displaying it to a world that had already stopped looking. But it is all still here, 1100 years of it. A steppe people who became a European kingdom, a grassland older than the continent's idea of itself, a language carried across mountains and never surrendered, a city floating on warm water, keeping its brightest grandeur and its darkest grief on the same stretch of river. The world decided a century ago that the conversation about Hungary was over. The Hungarians never agreed. And if you go there, if you stand on the plain in the evening, or on the bank of the Tisza when the water blooms, or in front of those iron shoes below the parliament, you understand that the conversation was never really theirs to end. It is one of the oldest, most beautiful, most quietly extraordinary countries in Europe. It has been here for 1,000 years. It is still here now. And it is, at last, worth talking about.